The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the upscale shopping district, its light glinting off rows of polished luxury vehicles. Sleek sedans, pristine SUVs with chrome trim, sports cars that cost more than most people's homes. Everything in this part of town spoke of money, of status, of belonging to a world where appearances were currency, and judgment was swift. Into this gleaming showcase rolled a vehicle that didn't belong. The engine sputtered and coughed, a rhythmic clattering that turned heads for all the wrong reasons. The car itself seemed to carry decades in its frame, its paint faded to a dull patina, its body marked by the honest wear of time and use. It moved slowly, almost apologetically, past the judgment of newer machines, and found a spot near the back of the lot, away from the crowd. The woman who emerged moved with the same quiet dignity as her vehicle. Her clothes were simple, clean but worn, the kind that spoke of careful mending and years of service. Her hands, weathered and strong, closed the door gently, as if the car were something fragile, something precious. She didn't notice the stares at first, didn't see the smirks exchanged between well-dressed shoppers, didn't hear the whispered comments about eyesores and declining neighborhoods. She was focused on her errand, on getting what she needed and returning home before the afternoon heat made the drive difficult. But the world around her had already made its judgment. In places like this, people measured worth by the shine of paint and the price of leather. They looked at her vehicle and saw failure, looked at her simple clothes and saw someone who didn't understand their world. They saw an outsider, an intruder in their carefully curated paradise of consumption and display. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly know, was the story that vehicle carried. The history held in every scratch, every dent, every carefully maintained component beneath that weathered hood. They didn't know about the hands that had first gripped that steering wheel, about the dreams that had been chased in that driver's seat, about the love that had kept it running long after most people would have given up. And they certainly didn't know that somewhere in that crowd of luxury and judgment, someone was about to recognize what they could not. That beneath the surface they dismissed so easily lay something far more valuable than any of their pristine possessions could ever be. Sometimes the most extraordinary treasures hide in the most ordinary shells, and one moment of recognition can change everything. Her name was Ruth, and she'd learned long ago to move through the world without expecting to be seen. 58 years had taught her that invisibility was often safer than attention, especially in places where people measured your value by what you drove and what you wore. She'd come to this shopping center only because it was the closest place to find the specific part she needed for her stove. Her own neighborhood had lost its hardware store 2 years ago, another casualty of rising rents and changing demographics. Now everything required driving to places like this, where the parking lots were vast, and the buildings sprawled like small cities. She moved toward the entrance, fishing in her worn purse for the list she'd written on the back of an envelope. Behind her, she heard laughter. Not the warm kind that invited you to share the joke, but the sharp kind that made you its target. 2 women in athletic wear that probably cost more than Ruth's monthly grocery budget stood near a luxury crossover, their eyes following her path. "Did you see that car?" one said, not bothering to lower her voice. "I didn't know they still made those." "They don't," her companion replied. "That thing's probably older than we are. Should be in a junkyard, not taking up space here." Ruth's shoulders tightened slightly, but she didn't turn. She'd heard variations of this her whole life. Comments about her secondhand clothes when she was young, about her modest home later, about her choices that never seemed to align with what people expected or approved. She'd learned that responding only gave them more ammunition, more opportunities to explain why she was wrong to exist as she did. Inside the hardware section, she found what she needed quickly. She'd always been efficient, practical, someone who knew exactly what she required and didn't waste time browsing things she couldn't afford. The young clerk barely glanced at her as he rang up the part, his attention fixed on his phone. The total appeared on the screen, and Ruth counted out exact change from her coin purse, another habit that drew amused glances from the people in line behind her. "Who carries coins anymore?" someone muttered. The walk back to her car felt longer. The afternoon had grown warmer, and the asphalt radiated heat in shimmering waves. She could see her vehicle from halfway across the lot, distinguished easily among the sleeker models by its distinctive shape, its honest acknowledgement of age. As she approached, she noticed someone standing near it. A man in an expensive suit, his hand shading his eyes as he peered through the driver's side window. Her first instinct was worry. Was something wrong? Had she parked improperly? Was he about to complain about her car's proximity to his own vehicle? But as she got closer, she noticed something odd about his posture. He wasn't examining her car with disgust or annoyance. He was studying it with something that looked almost like reverence. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "That's my car." The man straightened immediately, turning toward her. He was perhaps in his early 50s, with gray at his temples, and the kind of effortless polish that came from money and confidence. But his expression wasn't what she expected. His eyes were bright, almost excited. "Your car?" he repeated, as if testing the words. "This is actually your car?" Ruth felt defensive rising in her chest. "Yes. Is there a problem?" "A problem?" He laughed, but it wasn't the mocking sound she'd heard earlier. This was genuine, delighted. "Ma'am, do you have any idea what you're driving?" "It's a car," she said simply. Silence. "It gets me where I need to go." The man shook his head slowly, still smiling. "It's not just a car. Do you know what year this is?" 1953, Ruth replied. "It was my father's. He bought it new." The man's expression shifted to something deeper than excitement. Something closer to awe. 1953. Original owner's daughter. He walked slowly around the vehicle, his hand hovering near the body but not quite touching, as if afraid his contact might damage something precious. "Do you know how rare this is? How many of these are left in any condition, much less still running?" Ruth watched him, confusion mixing with a strange flutter of something she couldn't quite name. Most people made fun of her car. This man looked at it like it was art. "I've kept it maintained," she said quietly. "My father taught me how. He said if you took care of something properly, it would last forever." The man stopped walking and looked at her directly. "Your father was right, and you've done an incredible job. This isn't just a car, this is a piece of automotive history." Ruth felt heat in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She'd never heard anyone speak about her father's car this way. To everyone else, it was just old, just embarrassing, just evidence that she couldn't afford better. "I'm sorry," the man said suddenly, extending his hand. "I should introduce myself. I'm Richard. I own a vintage automobile museum about 40 miles from here. I've spent 30 years collecting and restoring significant vehicles, and I've never seen one of these outside of photographs." Ruth shook his hand hesitantly. "I don't understand. What's so special about it?" Richard's laugh was gentle this time. "What's special?" This model was revolutionary for its time. Independent suspension, aerodynamic design that was decades ahead of its competition. They only made them for 2 years before the company went bankrupt. Most were scrapped. Collectors have been searching for intact examples for half a century. He walked to the front, kneeling down to examine the chromework. "And this isn't just intact, this is pristine. You've maintained the original components, haven't you?" "Most of them," Ruth admitted. "My father kept detailed records. I just followed his notes." "Do you realize what this is worth?" Richard asked, standing up. Ruth shook her head. "It's not for sale. It's the only thing I have left of my father." "I understand," Richard said quickly. "I'm not trying to buy it, though I hope you'll let me give you my card, just in case you ever change your mind. But ma'am, you should know that what these people see as a junker, what they've probably been making fun of all morning, is worth somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million. The number hit Ruth like a physical force. She actually took a step backward, her hand reaching for the car to steady herself. "That's not possible." "It's absolutely possible," Richard said. "And given the condition, the documented maintenance history, the fact that it's been in the same family since new, it might be worth even more. There are collectors who would consider this the crown jewel of their entire collection." Ruth looked at her father's car, seeing it suddenly through different eyes. The faded paint wasn't neglect, it was original factory finish, aged with dignity. The worn interior wasn't shabby, it was authentic, untouched by misguided restoration. The clattering engine wasn't failing, it was singing the same song it had sung for 7 decades. "I had no idea," she whispered. "How could you?" Richard replied. "Most people don't understand what they're looking at. They see old and assume it means worthless." They don't recognize that some things become more valuable precisely because they've survived, because someone cared enough to keep them running. He pulled a business card from his wallet. Please, at least let me document this. Let me photograph it properly, record its history. Even if you never sell it. Even if you drive it for another 20 years. This vehicle deserves to be known. Deserves to be recognized for what it is. Ruth took the card, her hands trembling slightly. Why are you being so kind? Richard smiled. Because I love these machines. Because they represent something pure, a time when cars were built to last, when craftsmanship mattered more than planned obsolescence. And because anyone who's maintained a vehicle like this for decades, who's kept it running against all odds, deserves respect, not mockery. As if summoned by his words, the two women from earlier appeared, walking toward their luxury crossover. They saw Richard in his expensive suit talking to Ruth, and confusion crossed their faces. One of them started to say something, probably another joke about the old car, but Richard turned toward them. Beautiful vehicle, isn't it? He said loudly, gesturing to Ruth's car. The women stopped, uncertain. The car? One of them asked. Absolutely, Richard continued. Probably the most valuable vehicle in this entire parking lot. One of maybe 30 left in the world. I've been trying to acquire one for my museum for 15 years. They stared at him, then at Ruth, then at the car, as if seeing it for the first time. Ruth watched understanding slowly dawn on their faces, watched the dismissive judgment transform into stunned reassessment. I should let you go, Richard said to Ruth, quieter now. But please, think about what I said. About the documentation, at least. This car tells a story. Your father's story, your story. Those should be preserved. Ruth nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. She watched Richard walk away toward a pristine classic of his own, something beautifully restored and obviously expensive. But before he left, he turned back one more time. Ma'am, he called, your father would be proud. Not just of the car, of you. 3 weeks later, Ruth stood in her driveway watching a flatbed truck carefully loading her father's car. Not to sell it, she'd made that clear, but to bring it to Richard's museum for proper documentation, professional photographs, and a detailed historical record. Richard had insisted on paying her for the privilege, enough money to finally fix her roof, to replace her failing furnace, to stop choosing between medication and groceries each month. But more than the money, he'd given her something else. Recognition. Validation. Proof that her decades of careful maintenance, of following her father's notes, of resisting pressure to just get something newer, had meant something. The museum project had opened other doors, too. A local newspaper had written a story about the discovery, about the woman who'd unknowingly driven a treasure through town for years while people mocked her. The article had been shared thousands of times, and the comments section had become an unexpected education in judging by appearances. Ruth's phone had rung constantly for days. Electors wanting to know about other family vehicles. Vintage car clubs inviting her to shows. Even an invitation to speak at an automotive history conference, though she'd politely declined that one. But the most meaningful call had come from a young woman who'd read the article. Her grandmother had left her an old car, something the family wanted to junk. But after reading about Ruth, she'd decided to research it first. Turned out her grandmother's car was also rare, also valuable, also worth preserving. I almost let them junk it, the woman had said, her voice thick with emotion. I almost destroyed something she loved because I didn't understand. Thank you for sharing your story. Now, watching the museum truck pull away, Ruth thought about value. Real value, not the superficial kind measured in showroom shine and status symbols. Her father had valued craftsmanship, had bought a car that was engineered to last, not designed to be replaced. He'd valued knowledge, had kept meticulous records so that care could continue. He'd valued legacy, had passed those records to his daughter along with the vehicle they documented. And Ruth had valued his memory enough to honor those gifts, even when the world told her she was foolish, even when people laughed, even when it would have been easier to give up, to buy something newer, to stop standing out in parking lots full of gleaming judgment. Richard had returned her car 3 days later, pristine and documented. He'd cleaned it carefully, serviced components that Ruth's budget had forced her to defer, and presented her with a leather-bound book containing its complete history. In the front was a letter of authenticity, signed by 3 independent experts, certifying the vehicle's originality, condition, and estimated value. But he'd also included something else. A second letter, addressed to Ruth. "I've spent my career studying automotive history," he'd written. "I've examined vehicles owned by celebrities, by royalty, by the wealthiest collectors in the world. But I've never encountered a car that told a more important story than yours. This vehicle represents something our society has forgotten. That worth isn't determined by newness or flash or approval from strangers. That sometimes the most valuable things are the ones we hold on to when everyone else tells us to let go. That dignity and care and faithfulness to memory matter more than fitting in. Your father built a legacy. You've honored it. That makes you both richer than most people will ever be, regardless of what any appraiser says." Ruth had cried reading those words, the first real tears she'd shed since her father's death 5 years earlier. She'd held on to his car because she couldn't bear to lose the last piece of him. She'd never imagined it would teach the world a lesson about value. The parking lot incident had changed, too. Ruth still did her shopping in that district, still drove her father's car. But now, people approached her differently. Some wanted photographs. Others shared stories about their own family heirlooms, their own struggles to preserve things others didn't understand. The women who'd mocked her that first day had actually apologized, awkward and embarrassed. They'd admitted they'd never questioned what they'd been taught to value, had never considered that old might mean rare instead of worthless. Ruth had accepted their apology with grace, though she'd also gently suggested they might want to think about what other things in their lives they'd dismissed without looking deeper. On weekends, Ruth started attending vintage car shows. Not to show off, not to prove anything, but because she'd discovered a community. People who understood that maintaining something through decades of changing trends was itself an act of courage. Who recognized that the most beautiful things were often the ones that carried honest marks of time and use and love. At one show, an elderly man had approached her while she was sitting in a folding chair beside her father's car. "That's a beauty," he'd said, running his eyes over the familiar lines. "My dad had one just like it. Different color, but same model." Ruth smiled. "Did he keep it?" The man's face fell. "No, I made him sell it 30 years ago. Told him it was an embarrassment, that he needed something reliable. He never forgave me for that. Died 5 years later, still angry about it." He looked at Ruth with something raw in his expression. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel ashamed of honoring someone you loved. I wish I'd understood that before it was too late." After he walked away, Ruth sat quietly, thinking about all the times she'd almost given in. All the times the mockery had worn her down, had made her question whether she was being foolish, whether holding on to the past was preventing her from moving forward. She thought about how close she'd come to selling it a dozen times, to ending the maintenance struggle, to just fitting in, and she thought about what would have been lost if she had, not just a rare vehicle, not just automotive history, but her father's gift. The lesson he'd tried to teach her through his careful records, through his insistence that quality and care mattered more than convenience. That some things were worth the struggle of preservation. That value wasn't determined by popular opinion. The sun was setting now, painting her driveway in shades of amber and gold. Ruth ran her hand along the car's fender, feeling the subtle imperfections, the honest texture of 7 decades. Tomorrow she'd drive it to the grocery store. People would stare, some with recognition now, some still with judgment. She'd fill her trunk with practical purchases, drive home at a careful speed, park in her modest driveway. And she'd be grateful. Grateful that she'd held on when letting go would have been easier. Grateful that someone had recognized what others couldn't see. Grateful that her father's faith in quality, in endurance, in the value of things built to last had been vindicated. But mostly grateful for the lesson she could now share with anyone willing to listen. That the world's judgment means nothing compared to the truth of what you hold. That mockery from people who don't understand is the price of preserving what matters. That sometimes the most valuable treasures are the ones everyone else tells you to throw away. Have you ever held on to something the world told you was worthless, only to discover its true value later? Have you ever judged someone by surface appearances and missed the extraordinary story beneath? Ruth's car reminds us that worth isn't determined by shine or newness or the approval of strangers passing judgment in parking lots. True value lives in the stories things carry, in the love that preserves them, in the courage to honor what matters even when no one else understands. The next time you see something old, something worn, something that doesn't fit the modern definition of valuables, look closer. Ask questions. Consider that you might be standing before something rare, something precious, something that tells a story worth hearing. Because sometimes the greatest treasures hide in plain sight, waiting for someone with eyes trained to see past surfaces. Someone who understands that the most valuable things are often the ones that have survived against all odds, kept alive by hands that refuse to let go.